There we go.
I'm going to do my best Scott Hanselman impression. Oh, hello, friends. This is the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. There is no one watching, but you will watch it on delay, on your own terms. And I'm a little zoomed in here. I need to zoom out a bit. There we go. I'll go up slightly. There we go. I haven't been on here for like, what, a month?
It's been a while, right?
Yeah, you know, life happens. We've been doing other things. And anyway, so I'm here today. We thought even though Scott is traveling, being worldly,
he's somewhere between Copenhagen and Paris, I think.
Oh, is he literally on a plane?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's just us today.
Yeah.
Fellow dear watchers.
But I'll be honest, I nagged the heck out of both of you guys. I was like, it's been a long time. We just got to check in, right? So
yeah, that's true. That's true.
So I do have a bunch of community stuff. Should I just jump into some links?
Let's just go straight into John Loves Community.
It's so true. Okay, and working?
And I have locked onto you, so this should all be professional like Scott.
Excellent. Okay, so talking.net, lots of great content from them lately. And so this is on using Dapper ORM with ASP.NET Core. I'm going to fly through these a bit because I've got a lot of them. So.
Okay.
So this is from Daniel. He builds the React.js.net. So this is a kind of makes it very easy to build React applications with ASP.NET Core. If you're building a complex thing and you want to handle your loading and your libraries and all that, then that doesn't give you that level of control. But if you're doing some kind of standard React.js stuff, or you just kind of want to get started with it, this is great. So this just hit RC1. This is 3.0 RC1.
Shiny.
Yep, Philip. So he's posting on strongly typed configuration in ASP.NET Core without IOptions T. So.
Ooh.
Yeah, so always good stuff from him.
How did they achieve that exactly?
Honestly, I don't know.
You didn't read it.
I've got a lot of links here, and I'll be honest too. I had like maybe 5 or 10 more that I was like, this is a good post, but I'm trying to cut it down, right? So
you know what we've just accidentally done? We've invited everyone watching to try and surreptitiously slide in some article that is about something completely other, but create link bait.
Well,
so that you pick it up and show it on the show.
One problem with that theory is that in order to slip something by me like that, you've got to be Philip and post amazing content for about 4 years. And then, Philip honestly could probably slip some stuff by me, but. Okay, so this is from Matt, and this is about the .NET compiler platform. And so this is a new release of that. I think it's been a while since the previous release.
Just Roslyn.
Just Roslyn?
I mean, that's now, specifically, that is the code DOM providers that use Roslyn.
Now, can you enable this, though? This can be enabled as part of the code DOM? No?
Yeah, no. So what
Not
we
really.
did is when we shipped Visual Studio 2015, the current version, or was it one before that? Anyway, one of them, we added support in the templates via these NuGet packages and some web.config changes for using Roslyn to compile your Razor and ASPX pages, which are typically compiled by ASP.NET itself rather than being compiled by Visual Studio. They use ASP.NET Dynamic Compilation or the server-side compilation. We shipped a code DOM provider so that Roslyn was the thing that was compiling those. That was in order to do things like enable C#6 support in ASPX and Razor files. This is an update to that package.
Okay. That's it. All comes back, and I was like, it's on the web dev blog. I know it relates. I was forgetting what. Okay, cool. A couple from Andrew Locke. This is on injecting services into validation attributes in ASP.NET Core. One thing I love is he's got the TLDR on the top of each of his posts, so that's really nice.
Nice.
But he explains there's some difficulties normally in injecting services into action filters, and then he explains how you can use the validation context in order to use that. So that's nice. Another one from Andrew Locke. This is on using machine-specific configuration with ASP.NET Core. So specifically what he's doing here is using environment machine name, and he's got specific settings just for that. So nice kind of quick little tip, but this is really handy if you want to have specific configuration per machine.
Cool.
Post here from Rick Strahl on external network access to Kestrel and IIS Express in ASP.NET Core. Now, there's definitely the caveats of you normally don't want to do this, right? You want to front using, you want to front and then point back into your application. But here he's showing how if you do want to point to Kestrel, here's how you're going to do that, like binding
Sure,
to the
yeah.
URL.
We still haven't sort of blessed Kestrel as a public-facing edge server.
Exactly. Yeah.
Working through that. And so we always recommend that you treat it just as your application server and you put it behind something that reverse proxies HTTP, such as IIS or AJ proxy or Nginx or whatever.
Yep. So this is a nice tip from from Scott Allen. So here he's talking about setting up some commands for database migrations and seeding in ASP.NET Core. So what he's doing here is he's creating some different things, and then he's able to go in, and where's his command that he does that? He basically says like he calls in to migrate and seed and everything. Oh, here it is. So this is he says .NET run drop DB, migrate DB, seed DB. Like you can just call that all from your .NET command itself.
Yeah, so that's interesting specifically because EF core doesn't have database initializers and thus does not have seeding, which the previous version of EF did. And so I had to do a bunch of this stuff myself in the benchmarks repo app and a couple of other apps. And this is the EF team is talking about adding that type of support back again, but right now this is a perfectly good pattern for doing this type of stuff.
Great.
Yeah.
Cool. So here's one from Barry Dorans. This is a repo on cookie sharing, and so this is on sharing authentication between ASP.NET 4.5 and .NET Core.
Seriously cool.
Yep. So this is again on verbs in general, but this is Matt Warren, and he's talking about, this is specific to .NET Core, not just ASP.NET, but talking about how you can create your own verbs for the .NET CLI tooling. So in this, you can go in, you could say, his example, he uses benchmark.net, and he sets it up so you can say .NET benchmark, right? So.
Right, yeah, so this is adding what we call a tool. So we have project tools, which you see you can reference we have them referenced in our default template, and that adds .NET space verb, and he's explicitly exploiting the capability of the CLI to search the path for things. And then what we hope to do in a future version is formalize a global tools story for the CLI so that you could, for example, type .NET, .NET space tools space install -G, some great package name, and then that would add a CLI tool into a special location that the CLI could always find it, and then you could just go to any folder and type .NET my tool name, and it would just work on any project. That's something that doesn't exist yet, but we're looking at building.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so this caused me to kind of think back a second. This is global, right? So you're saying this is a .NET global command versus what, like, for example, what Scott's doing here, this is specific to your project or whatever, right, if you're going into your project Jason.
Yeah, basically the CLI, and there's a bunch of docs about this. The CLI has some dispatching logic, such that when you type .NET space some string, some word, it goes through a bunch of rules to figure out what it's actually going to execute. And if you know those rules and they're documented, you can plug into it. And what we don't have is a formal mechanism for delivering tools that it can sort of work with that model, other than project tools. But we want to support global tools so you don't have to install them in every single project, because some things just make more sense to say, I install them as part of my tool chain, and then they're just there, just like you do sort of NPM global installations.
Great. Okay, so this is from Jeremy Miller, and he talks through his experience in migrating Storyteller to Core CLR. So again, this is .NET Core specific. It's not just ASP.NET, but he's kind of, here's some things I ran into, here's some things I really love about it, here's some things that were a struggle, so some general, just good tips as you're migrating to Core CLR. So this is from Maxime, and he's talking about creating a .NET Core console web job on ASP.NET Core. So that's a
nice,
neat one. So this is from, there were some Docker announcements and things as part of during Ignite, and one thing was this. One thing that I saw as I was digging into that. So this is, I think his name is Michael Fries, but he's created this sample application using ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework, and SQL Server. And so this is all on Docker. So if you would like to see an actual more than one machine, there's some things working together and all that, that's this is a good example. So, and Michael works for Docker, and so this, I would trust what he's doing here. Cake, they've hit the 0.16 release and include .NET Core support. So Cake is a really nice kind of build system, and so you get you write your build script in C#, some really nice things there. But so this is their announcement of that, and they also since then have also announced Visual Studio support. So yeah, great. I don't know, I've got a podcast coming out very soon on with an interview with them, and it kind of blew my mind, all the stuff they're working on. Some really amazing stuff. So this is Fanny Renders, and he's written Stubber, which is a simple request stub provider for ASP.NET Core. So this is if you just want to say request to this returns this, that kind of thing. So it's just a nice provider for that. So Hisham, he's got request filtering for ASP.NET Core apps. So this is continuing the series, and here he's looking at building abstractions and implementation APIs. So, so continuing on his series there.
Okay.
Yep. Let me see. So this one, this is Alex, and this is running IIS and ASP.NET Core apps on Windows 10 with Docker.
Are you sure that's Core?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
No.
I think you might find that's full existing ASP.NET, which was one of the...
There you go. You're right.
Yeah, that was one of the big announcements from Ignite.
You're right. Okay.
Was Docker is in the box in Windows Server 2016, and you can run like web forms or MVC5 applications on full .NET framework running on IIS in a Docker container on Windows Server 2016.
Well, I'll use my get out of jail free card, this is the ASP.NET community stand-up, not only Core. So
exactly.
All right. So this is from Steve, and this is on building optimized Docker images with ASP.NET Core. So we got some. We talked about this with Glenn, recently, and so this is where he's talking about specifically how to build and optimize your images so they work well with Core and how that's done. So good stuff. Yeah. So this one's pretty neat. This is from Maher, and he's got Simple Commerce, which it's out on GitHub, and it is an e-commerce system using EF Core, ASP.NET Core, kind of all the new stuff. So pretty good looking application, and so that's a nice open source project there. Steve Gordon, he's talking about HTML encoding a JSON request body. So yeah. Just slipped this one in under the wire, came in today, so nice to see that. And then one other one I wanted to include here, and I don't know how much you wanted to mention or whatever, but I think it's good to know about is this this big one from Immo on .NET Standard. So
yes, people should read that.
A lot of stuff in there,
and it may take them a few reads to really grok, and it may even be that even after a few reads, because we don't have the tooling, like this isn't announced yet, this is announcing the plans for what we're currently working on. It's not actually shipping .NET Standard 2. Obviously, we've already shipped some versions of .NET Standard that happened as part of .NET Core. This is talking about the vision for .NET Standard 2 and specifically solving some of the problems with the current incantation of .NET Standard and .NET Core and how this will fix that, namely bringing back a lot more of the APIs. How that will actually land in terms of a great tooling experience, well, it's hard to tell yet because we're still building it. But we are, the post makes it very clear we're dedicated to making that experience as good as it possibly could be. But read it. It's a really good read. There's a short section at the top where if you just want to get the overview, the summary, you should just read that. But if you want to dive into some lower level detail, including like the crazy what assemblies actually live in what packages and what happens if I go to this assembly but the thing was looking for this API and how type forwards work and all that craziness, there is some detail on that in there as well.
Cool. I'm done.
You're done.
I'm done.
Oh, I will unlock you.
All right.
Look at that. So smooth. So yeah, what's happened in the meantime? So the .NET Standard thing is definitely worth reading. Like I said, there's kind of a number of large things that the team is working on at the moment in parallel. And when I say the team, I mean the wider team, not just ASP.NET. Obviously, we're all one org now. Obviously, there's the upcoming minor release. So we did our 1.0 release in June this year. And so we have a minor release that's upcoming. Anyone who follows along on GitHub will know that we've been working on features and that we're in the process of locking that down right now. So that'll be 1.1. effectively. And there's a bunch of new features coming along with that. They're up on the roadmap. And so we have the URL rewriting middleware. We have response caching middleware, which we're working through right now, some DI things. We've got the web listener server for people who need the features of HTTP/sys on Windows. We have a really cool new feature in MVC, which lets you configure middleware as MVC filters. And so MVC has always had this filter pipeline, right? So you can have action filters and resource filters and auth filters and yada, yada, yada. And they're kind of, they're a pipeline just like the HTTP pipeline, which is composed of middleware, except this is MVC specific. So now there's a bridge that lets you say, take this middleware and plug it into the MVC pipeline. And as a result of that, we've been able to take the localization middleware that does the culture stamping on a request, so that when a request comes in, it looks at characteristics of the request, like headers and cookies, whatever else that you want to write the code for, and then puts a particular culture on that request, so that things like number formatting and resource string lookup is in the appropriate culture for the client. We can now take that function and we can sit it in front of routing, or actually behind routing. Today it's middleware, so it sits in front of routing because routing itself is middleware. But what if you want the culture to be part of the URL, which is a very common pattern that you see, right? You see, you go to Xbox and it redirects you to Xbox/en-us. You would typically naturally say, well, that should be a route token. I should define a route that has culture as one of the tokens, and then that would flow into some culture provider that the middleware would use. But because they're both middleware, and you don't really generally add routing yourself, it gets added as part of MVC. That was always a little unnatural. So with this feature, we'll also be shipping a request culture provider that's based on routing, so that now you can put a named token into a route. I can't remember what it is, it's culture or something like that. And then you can configure the request localization middleware after routing as an MVC filter, so that will then localize everything after that as it runs through the MVC request pipeline. So it's just new primitives that allow us to do more rich composition. So that's coming, which is nice. View components as tag helpers, which I believe one of the interns showed on one of the things not too long ago. View pre-compilation. And so there'll be a command line tool that you can use to pre-compile your Razor views, which drastically helps improve startup time for your ASP.NET Core applications. Generally, you would make that part of your publish pipeline. So when you're doing local development, you don't generally do that. But then when you run through publish, you call this tool, it compiles all the Razor files in your app into DLLs, and those or into one DLL actually in this case, and then that gets shipped with your app. And then you don't have to ship the Razor files with your app, and you don't incur the cost of finding the Razor files and then compiling them, which involves loading Roslyn, and Roslyn's quite a large assembly, so it involves JIT time, which is multiple seconds. So it can actually shave quite a lot of time off your startup time by pre-compiling. We've had this in ASP.NET forever. We didn't have it in ASP.NET Core. That's coming in 1.1. A new temp data provider. So the temp data provider in MVC today. So temp data, for those who don't know, is the feature in MVC that lets you set a piece of data in response to a request, and then that data lasts for the current user for exactly one more request. So it's really useful for post redirect get scenarios, where you say post to create an entity, and then you want to redirect back to the list page that would show, the new entity would be in the list now, but you want to say show a success message. Say, hey, the entity was created. Well, that's a redirect back to there. So how do you know that you can pass something through the query string, but then that's open to manipulation by the client? So maybe you send a code through the query string, and then you have code, you send a cookie value, but then now you have to encrypt the cookie value to make it secure. Otherwise, now you can put stuff in a cookie that the server will replay. So we wrote a temp data provider. Today's temp data is based on session, which is all server-based, but it requires you to set up session. So we've written a cookie-based temp data provider. So you can just round trip the data to that client in a cookie, but it's still encrypted by all the stuff, that data protection that's configured in your application. So that's nice. So you don't have to set up session, which is an external dependency. We've got some stuff to improve stuff in Azure. So we've got a new Azure integration method that you can call on Web Host Builder, which just sets up a couple of things for you. And then over time, as we more deeply look at how we can make ASP.NET Core run better in Azure App Service, this method can just kind of magically turn more stuff on for you. So right now, what it will do is set up logging, so that if you have this method, it'll and then you deploy to Azure App Service, you can go into the portal and tick on the application diagnostic stuff and say, hey, log to table storage or blob storage, I think it is, or log to the file system. You tick those boxes in the portal and it'll work, right? Today in ASP.NET Core, that doesn't work, which is kind of annoying. So we're fixing that. We're also looking at how to better integrate with Key Vault, which is the secret manager in Azure. So we're still working through those things, how it works with configuration, how it would work with the data protection APIs. We're working through that at the moment. And it also does things like turns on the IIS integration support for you automatically, so you don't have to go and call that method specifically. So it's just kind of a one method you put on web posts, and then like Azure stuff lights up. And if you're not running on Azure, it does nothing, right? It's like most of these things. It works if you're there and doesn't do anything if it's not. So that's kind of nice. And then some other stuff is taking longer, and so we'll be in the next minor release after that. And so we're working on that stuff now, but it's more long lead. It's going to take more than like a month or two to do. And so those things include WebSockets, Signaler, which we're doing a lot of work on as of the last week or so. So David's been prototyping a whole bunch of stuff along with other people on the team. We're doing a lot of whiteboarding here to sort of reimagine what Signaler in real time looks like on ASP.NET Core. And we have a really nice model, we think, right now that we're working through.
Is that all the channel stuff that he's talking about? Or
so channels is kind of a layer lower.
Okay.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming periods. But channels is, like I said, lower. So this would be built on top of channels, but that's more for our benefit than anyone else's right now. But over time, depending on what direction channels goes, because this will more be an internal implementation for now. It's not something that the customer will have to worry about. Depending on what directions channels go, it may end up resulting in sort of more tangible benefits to customers. Channels, one of the nice things about channels at the moment is it's very easy to switch out different implementations of the underlying sort of channel provider. So we could build, Kestrel on top of channels as an abstraction. And then if you want to run Kestrel on top of libuv, or you want to run Kestrel on top of .NET sockets, or you want to run Kestrel on top of Rio, which is a Windows proprietary socket API, you don't have to change Kestrel, right? And thus nothing up the stack has to change either, because you just flip out that little thing. And it's more than just a socket abstraction. Channels is quite literally an abstraction for how do we do efficient the pumping of bytes back and forward over a particular channel, which is why it's called that. And that could be in memory, it could be remote, and do it in the most memory efficient way possible by taking care of things for me like pooling. And if I need to turn those bytes into a string, do that without allocating lots and lots of memory. In fact, do it without allocating any memory if you can. And then if I'm trying to parse a bunch of bytes like we do in a web server and say, oh, this line looks like I got a bunch of bytes and I need to find the carriage return line feed. How do I do that type of search in a memory efficient way without having to do a bunch of memory management myself and kind of tear my hair out? So those are the types of things we're trying to solve with that. So anyway, ASP.NET Core Sockets, which is the working name we're giving to this new abstraction that Signaler will be built on top of, is something that we're working through right now, which is kind of exciting. So that, for people who are wondering when Signaler is going to land, it's next year. So Signaler RTM is currently slated for around, I don't know, let's just say mid next year. So that's the kind of rough time frame we're talking about, but there would be a preview before that, probably early next year. Similar to Razor Pages, which we have called controllerless views or web pages, vNext, or a whole bunch of different names. We went through an effort where we built a big prototype, and I think I showed that on here like a month and a half ago. We're now in the phase where we've learned everything we wanted to learn from the prototype, and we're doing the work to actually build the real framework. So that's been really valuable, and I'm really happy with where we've landed on that. And we would hope to have a preview of that out in sort of the same time as when the Signaler preview would be out. We might have a preview of that out a little earlier, but we'll see how we go. But that would land as an RTM the same time Signaler would, about mid next year. And then there's some ongoing work with web API security. So how do you issue tokens for your web APIs from ASP.NET Core without, today you can use Identity Server 4 as that's now available. But there are people who are perhaps looking for a more focused solution, although Identity Server is great. And then how do I take, how do we solve the larger identity story with ASP.NET Core? Like if I move my stuff to Azure, how does it integrate? Do I still have a database for my customers in my app, or do I kind of use the larger Azure storage stuff and identity management and all those sort of things? So we're kind of looking at that whole sphere as a particularly interesting problem and trying to figure out our integration story there, which is cool. And there's a bunch of other smaller things. Like we're just working through a whole bunch of stuff. So that's features for that sort of train. But then there's obviously all the MS Build work that we've been talking about since the RTM as well. That's all going full whack at the moment. And we'll have more to say about that and the status of that in the coming weeks or so. But I can say that, we're working on it. The team is incredibly busy on that. And
those repos are out there too, right? I mean, there's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's eagle-eyed can go and look in the NuGet repository, look in the Roslyn C# project system repository, and look in the CLI repository, and all that work is happening publicly from a coding point of view. But we haven't sort of done the big, hey, here's the big summary for general consumption of how this is going to look. Because if you looked in there, you would see an awful lot of churn, and it's quite jarring because obviously. Anyway, so we have shared some plans with a bunch of customers so far. We're getting good feedback, and so we're going to the next phase of that soon, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. So that's going on. The .NET Standard 2 work, which you alluded to from that great blog post that Imo from the .NET team put up, that work is ongoing as well. So there's kind of a bunch of parallel, very large efforts going on right now. And that will hopefully land sometime soon as well. I think that's more of a next year thing. But again, sort of the same sort of timeframes, not sort of this time next year, much earlier than that. And .NET Standard 2 promises to solve a bunch of the problems that people had, either with building PCLs for .NET Core or just targeting .NET Core in general because of the lack of certain APIs, and the classic issue of just how do I build .NET code that runs on all these great platforms that you have. So that's really, that'll land at that time as well, and you'll see the trickle effects of that roll through all the platforms. .NET Framework, .NET Core, and Xamarin will be updated in those timelines as well to work with those things. So yeah, lots of stuff going on. And I'm sure there's stuff I'm forgetting.
One question, and you've probably answered this for me at least a dozen times, but I'm always watching all the crazy stuff that's going on with Kestrel, right? And there's been some crazy things lately that people have been looking at as far as
Debrusion sequences.
Yeah, and then after that, I don't know if you saw Ben's thing about Ben's magic number. And so now
we've got Ben's magic number, which does away with the debrusion sequence completely.
So what's the flow on, crazy people come up with insane optimizations on it. What's the flow between that going on and it actually hitting something that's shipping in Kestrel? How does Kestrel rev?
So Kestrel revs no differently to anything else in this stack. So we shipped 101 of the entire. So there was a blog post about this on the .NET Core blog post, the .NET blog post, not long ago, about LTS and FTS. And about the new support policy around those. There will be another post coming up soon that talks about how we think about the release cadence with this new model. And so we would very much like to move to a model where it's a little more predictable for everybody. And you have some understanding of what a minor release is and what a patch release is and what a major release is and what the timelines for those look like, so that we're not all just kind of shooting in the dark and having to say things that are a little cryptic because we haven't quite announced things yet or whatever. So you'll see movement on that soon, which is great. And Kestrel is just part of that greater stack, right? When we think of .NET Core or the stuff that we shipped in June, it's a whole bunch of packages, it's a runtime you can install, and it's a bunch of tools. So it's kind of three things. When it comes to the packages and the runtime, they're really the things that we talk about when we mean LTS and FTS, and the cadence of those things. And like what you just asked is, well, if I submit a bug request or a fix to a particular thing or an improvement, when can I expect that to appear in the final shipped product in a supported manner? And does it appear in a patch to LTS, or does it go into the next minor release of /FTS, or is it such a big change that it has to go into the next major version? And how do I reason about what the time frames are for those? We will share all that stuff soon. We're still working through the details of that. But I'm very hopeful that people will like what we've come up with.
Cool.
I hope so. So that's cool. But yeah, this latest one was just kind of crazy. There was a random, so I realized you were trying to find the least significant bit in the result of a vector mask. And I saw you were doing a quasi tree search. This looks like it could use a debrusion sequence. And then everyone in here was like, what's a debrusion sequence? Wikipedia. And so looking at the boards and math. And then there was one guy who really understood it and had to educate all of us. And then, so we're like, yeah, okay. And in micro optimization, sure, it saves some cycles. I mean, this code path was actually has quite a lot of contention when you're doing benchmarks, because we have to parse bytes a lot. But then Ben, being Ben, went off and he was looking, he's like, I just think this could be better. And then realized that in our special case, we could optimize the code even further, and we avoided an entire lookup, and Ben calculated this magic number, which quite literally, I think in the pull request had a variable called Ben's magic number. That's the fun. That's part of the fun of open source. It's a lot of crazily smart people who are forcing us to look at things, which is just great. And we're not always going to take these things. Like we always make these decisions about whether it makes sense to do this, but people are interested. Like it's great. So it's good fun.
Cool. There are a few questions. I don't know if you want to take any off of Getter real quick.
Sure, let's do it.
All right. Yeah, let's see. Okay. Hisham's asking, is there a need to use temp data provider if you already have sessions?
If you already are using session, then no, you can use the session-based temp data provider. They're just different storage mechanisms, right? So they have different properties as a result of them being used differently. So a session-based storage provider for temp data means that you have potentially contention because it's remote and it has to be synchronized. And the way the session works is in the ASP.NET Core is very different to how it worked in System Web, where it was a pessimistic lock model, where it would basically lock all incoming requests with the same session ID. So it became a natural point of contention as soon as we started building apps that were more sort of Ajax focused, where you were making a request and then maybe making Ajax requests while that was still happening. They would all get blocked. So it was really annoying. So that's, for example, why there's no session in Signaler, because you can't do that because it locks the request pipeline.
I mean, just in terms of optimization too, my understanding is, I would want to use temp data because it's going to clear it out after that request. Whereas I otherwise, if I'm throwing a bunch of stuff in session, I'd worry about my session.
Oh no, I think you mean specifically the default temp data provider that we ship today is the session.
Oh, provider. Right. Got it.
Yeah, it goes via session. The problem with that is that if you just say add MVC and then you call the temp data API, it throws because MVC doesn't depend on session. It depends on temp data, which is an abstraction, but there's no implementation for temp data in MVC. And so out of the box, if you do file new MVC and then try to use temp data, it explodes, which is horrible. Right? And I'm looking at this and I'm going, this is just a horrible experience. So then you can say, oh, okay, with configure session, wire it all up, it works, but it just bugged me. Like I'm looking at the problem of temp data. I'm like, well, why don't we just round trip this in the cookie? Now, cookies have their own limitations. They have a size limitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for the types of things that I typically use temp data for, which is always just the post redirect get type of thing, where I want to show a status message as a result of the post that occurred before the redirect, cookies are perfect for that as long as I can secure them appropriately so that I'm confident that I was the one who put the data in there before I show it back to the user. Yeah, so that's why you do it.
Okay. Here's one. I'm not sure if this one's applicable, but Martin's asked, the .NET SDK is not public. He says the current CLI already uses it in templates. There's some stuff, .NET new type, MS build, etc. Is that SDK going to be made public?
Sorry, I have absolutely no idea.
Okay.
We'd have to ask the .NET team.
Yep. And they do have a stand-up too, so that might be a good thing to throw into theirs. So Kyle's asking, can I deploy an ASP.NET Core application to an Azure web role, so using cloud services instead of app service?
The answer is yes, but it is not turnkey, right? It's not an out-of-the-box experience. So with web roles, and that, I'm speaking a little off the cuff. I've never done this myself. You can pretty much deploy anything you want to a web role because you create a deployment package. You can write put a script in it, and you can tell it to download a new version of the .NET framework and install that. But it'll do it every time your web role gets redeployed because the VM gets switched out from underneath you. You can do the exact same thing with ASP.NET Core, or you could choose to package or to deploy the application in standalone mode, effectively. Where you package the entire .NET Core runtime with your application. That has a lot of caveats by doing that, though, unfortunately. So I'm still much more of an advocate of the portable runtime or the portable application/shared runtime model. That seems to be more applicable for these types of scenarios, but do what makes sense for your scenario. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is you'd have to do a bit of work to do it yourself.
Yeah.
I can check and report back on if there's been any movement on making that a more first-class thing.
Cool. Okay. Nicola's asking if we can share any plans on the migration. Let me see. Is it possible to know the plans to migrate ASP.NET Core docs to docs.microsoft.com, moving from Sphinx to Markdown?
I don't have any data on that.
All right.
I could report back. Who's asking that?
Nicolo?
Okay, it's just interesting.
Yeah.
That is the intent. So the intent, I can say that the intent is we want to move all the docs to the new docs.microsoft.com site where the .NET Core docs are, for example, and it's just a process to do that.
Okay. Tim's asking, when will the tooling of ASP.NET and MVC be RTM quality? He has tool vendors waiting on tooling to stabilize so they can evolve their products like
Yes,
nCrunch.
that hasn't changed in the initial announcement. That will be done in the same timeline as VS 15.
Okay. Let me see. I think that's it. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
All right, then.
Great success.
Thanks, everyone.
We just ran a stand-up without Scott.
We did. Now, this stand-up won't be on the website until Scott
That's right.
it. The list of old shows on the website, just to remind people, is driven by the playlist that Scott owns. And for him to get this one, which is on my account, into his playlist takes like gymnastics and stuff. So it may not show up in there for a couple of weeks. But
like literally, he downloads it, rips it, and re-uploads.
I believe he literally downloads it, rips it back in, adds it back in, and then puts it in his playlist. And he has to reorder the playlist and all that sort of stuff. So
fun.
We still haven't fixed that. Like we're a year and a half into this show, I think, and we still haven't come up with a better process.
Yeah.
All right. I will instigate dramatic zoom out myself.
Oh, sounds good.
Oh, it's not. There I am. I got a little.
I was too slow to do my dramatic.
I've done it wrong because what's happened? I think what usually happens. I got to do it again. Sorry, that was just terrible.
Yeah.
I think usually what happens is Scott locks it on me.
This is good for me because I can do dramatic flashing lights.
Wow. Yeah. I thought I was using internet. All right, so I'm going to lock it on me now, and then dramatic zoom out is more dramatic and more effective. Bye, buddy.